Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today on our coffee break webinar on Now What? How to use program evaluation findings for project continuous improvement. We're so thrilled that you decided to take time to join us this afternoon. Hopefully you have a hot cup of coffee with you to learn as you take a quick break from other assignments that you have. We want to make sure that your experience this afternoon is a positive one, and to help aid that, make sure to ask any questions that you have. If you look on your screen on the right-hand side, there's a place for you to be able to enter in questions. And we have with us Madison Doty, our research assistant, and Elise Hopes to help field some of those questions. Pivoting. Pivoting is a word that we've heard a lot of right now. Pivoting is when the data tells you that you need to go into a different direction. Pivoting is when your expected approach to achieve an outcome doesn't work and you need to change or pivot to another direction or another approach. In grants, needing to pivot to achieve goals and objectives is common. And I think that part of the utility of evaluation is that evaluation provides a formal process for pivoting. While there are many different definitions for evaluation, the one that I like to use is this one. Evaluation is the use of social science research methods to systematically investigate the effectiveness of social intervention programs. Let me take a moment right here to real quickly introduce myself. I'm Lana Rucks, the principal consultant with the Rucks Group. The Rucks Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past several years, we have worked with primarily higher ed entities on grants funded by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and Department of Labor. During our time together, there are 4 things that I'm hoping to accomplish. First, I want to show how reframing the purpose of evaluation will help aid in thinking about using evaluation for continuous improvement purposes. Next, I want to talk about developmental evaluation and how developmental evaluation is another way of using evaluation findings towards continuous improvement efforts. Then I want to address another issue that can be very challenging for projects, and that's how to get other people on board. How do you rally the troops, in a sense, of other individuals who are willing to use program evaluation results for continuous improvement? And while it's listed here last, it's definitely not least, we want to make sure that we're answering your questions. So again, any question that comes up, make sure to pose those on the question side of your screen. So let's go ahead and get started. In thinking about program evaluation and the use of evaluation findings, there are really 2 broad purposes. One is for learning or improving, as I call it, or measuring impact, which is just primarily, as I frame it, in terms of proving. And those 2 different frames are really important, and how you think about evaluation in terms of those frames are critical in terms of how you're actually going to interact with the evaluation, if you're working with an external evaluator, or just an evaluation champion who may be internal to the team. Let's see what they mean by this. So let's take this ambiguous figure. You're looking at this, trying to understand what the figure is. And you may conclude and say, oh, what I'm looking at is an H. And so as a consequence, you look at it and then you say, oh, it's a dot. That's how I can interact with it. That's how I can use it as an H. But what if it's not an H? What if it's actually an A and you make cat out of the word? Well, this is going to be a really simple example, but the whole point really is how we frame something really determines how we interact with it. So whether we frame evaluation as purely for reporting out to funders and for proving purposes, or rather we're talking about improving, will really make a difference in how we approach that work. As in another example of this, one of my favorite books is by Bill Walsh, who was the head coach for the San Francisco 49ers. And when he began as head coach in the late 70s, early 80s, the 49ers were not the winning team. It was under his leadership that it really became a winning team. And essentially his philosophy was that don't focus on earning scores. Don't focus on winning per se. Focus on excellence. Excellence is a much broader area. It will take you much farther, and just focusing on the score is limiting. Hence the title of the book, The Score Takes Care of Itself. So essentially what his philosophy was this: let's not focus on the score. Let's focus on excellence, and score is going to be nested within excellence. Well, I liken that same idea to evaluation. You don't have to focus on proving. You don't have to focus on how do you report out to the funders or internal stakeholders on the outcomes of an initiative. If you focus on improving, proving will take care of itself. So here's an example in action. One of the projects that we're working on is geared towards increasing participation in STEM by increasing the number of individuals or students who are majoring in STEM areas, and that's going to be achieved through retaining students in those majors and staying in those majors. One way to help with retention is to increase performance by offering students tutoring. And I'm not sure if you're aware of, in some of the projects that you may have worked on, sometimes students are very reluctant to take advantage of tutoring, even though it's offered and even though it's free. So in this situation, the project team was really interested in understanding what the impact of tutoring, and particularly because naturally they created really 3 different conditions in which students were participating in tutoring. So in this project, there were 3 conditions. The first group, they were required to participate in tutoring to receive a stipend. So they actually received money and a financial incentive if they participated in tutoring. And group 2, these were individuals who weren't required, but they did participate in some way in tutoring. And in group 3, these are students that didn't participate in tutoring at all. And what we found in this project was that for individuals who were actually participating in tutoring and that they were incentivized in some way to participate, that they actually had the lowest rates of failure across the 3 conditions. But regardless whether they were incentivized or if they just participated in tutoring at all, their rates of failure decreased. What's also interesting is that those individuals who received an incentive also had the highest rates of A's. A's and B's actually combined, but particularly with A's, those highest rates. And if you also notice that it also provides some insight into the dose that's needed for those types of outcomes, actually provides some insight. Now, I have to caution this and say these are preliminary findings, but they are encouraging, and the project team is able to use this to help to persuade faculty members and administrators around having some type of requirement for students to participate in tutoring. So ultimately, by doing that and doing that early within the project, they'll be more likely to see the outcomes later down the road. Let's look at another example as well. In this example, this was a workshop that was geared towards career readiness. So very often you'll hear about individuals who don't necessarily have the soft skills, they're not quote unquote job ready, they don't have those career readiness skills. So this was a workshop designed to address that. And in this workshop, very much like a lot of workshops or surveys. We disseminated the pre and post survey. Actually, it was a counterfactual survey that was used. And so the findings weren't horribly surprising that they participated in this workshop. They learned more afterwards overall than what they learned before. But what stood out was this interesting finding here. When asked if you know what you're supposed to bring to an interview, students reported that they understood that more before participating in a session than afterwards. And what was great from the project team standpoint is they looked at those results and started to self-reflect, and we had discussions on it to try to understand why we were observing that finding, and concluded that maybe there was some confusion. So they're going to go back and look at that section of the workshop to see if there was something that can be reworked to make sure that's more understood. So by doing that and doing that on the early side, again, more likely to actually achieve the outcomes. So let me go ahead and pause there and see if there are any questions. Madison, are there any questions from the group yet?
Hi, Lana. There are. If all I'm interested in is outcomes, why should I be interested in continuous improvement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I recently was working with a project team, and we were actually responding to questions from a program officer. So, often you submit a proposal, and right before it gets submitted, there will be additional questions from the program officer, and you respond back. And in that response back, I had put in this kind of continuous improvement piece, and actually the PI had this question about, what do you mean by continuous improvement? What are you talking about, and what is being improved? And I think fundamentally that by focusing on the continuous improvement, you will get to your outcomes. And that by doing that earlier in the process, there are many benefits. One that we've seen is that it strengthens out your data gathering system. So if you just wait until the end to gather data, sometimes you realize the system for data gathering isn't as strong, you're not getting good quality data, and so the outcomes that you want aren't really being achieved as strongly as you would like. So fundamentally, that by focusing on continuous improvement, you're actually able to really make sure that you have strong outcomes. And actually, that presents a really nice segue. I don't know if there are any other questions from this portion, Madison?
Not at the moment. That's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, then that actually creates a really nice segue for the next portion in terms of thinking about developmental evaluation. What I was starting to allude to before is that with continuous improvement, there are a lot of ways in which with developmental evaluation and that framework of evaluation that really can help in terms of how to deal and address with new initiatives and new projects. And so let me give first a definition of what developmental evaluation is. So developmental evaluation is it supports innovation development to guide adaptation to emergent and dynamic realities in complex environments. So there's a lot of words there, so let me kind of tease that apart for a moment. So when we talk about innovation, for a lot of the projects that we work with, these are new projects, new initiatives in some way. And even if there's some piece of the project that's repeating or replicating something that's been done previously, it's being implemented in a new context because it's being implemented in a new part of the country, or it's being implemented differently because it involves different individuals, different majors. And so it's really talking about this newness, this idea that an individual may have, and they're trying to figure out how to implement. The other piece is that it's adaptation to emergent and dynamic realities. If you've worked on a project, you know that there's a really different experience in terms of what you write when you're developing a proposal and what those realities are when you're actually implementing. And so developmental evaluation, that framework, helps to create a way of thinking about how to approach and handle these emergent components. And emergent can be big and small. They could be small things like you have a shift in an individual who's a champion in the organization for the initiative, and so that person's left the organization, and somebody who comes in is not quite as enthused. Or it could be big, and it could be big like having to deal with COVID-19 and social distancing. How do you deal with those emergent factors? We know that we have a lot of projects right now that have either summer camps for students or project development for teacher and faculty members. And so trying to figure out, well, how do we address these emergent and dynamic realities? And then the other piece, these complex environments, is that you're putting that initiative in a system. It's organic. And when you put in an initiative, you have to be sensitive to those complex factors and sensitive to that complexity. And so those are all really important factors. So one way to help think about this is in framing it in regards or comparing this against the processes that are associated within research and how you think about research and those processes. So a lot of times you hear this overlap between the commonalities between research and evaluation, and there are definitely, as I said, in terms of those processes. So in research, you have a hypothesis, you develop research questions, you test the hypothesis, and then you analyze the findings. And then importantly, you refine those hypotheses. Well, in evaluation, it follows a very similar process as well. You start with a theory of change. You have a theory of change about how an initiative will work. You develop evaluation questions. You test that theory of change through the project implementation. You analyze your findings, and then you refine your theory of change through the implementation process. So, in thinking about evaluation in that way from this developmental evaluation lens, the engagement of evaluation in the life cycle of the project will be slightly different. So, in thinking about the activity life cycle of a project, you have these different decision points. And if you're not thinking about evaluation as being an integral part to help with continuous improvement or from developmental evaluation, you may not be as focused on aligning evaluation to those decision points. So the evaluation and the decisions of the project are not in alignment. Whereas within a developmental context, what you want to make sure that you're doing is within those decision points, you're also closely aligning the evaluation to be leveraged to help with really good data-informed decision-making processes. So let's look at an example of this. So in another project that we were working with, the project team held an outreach event to students and their parents to introduce them to a new major that the school was implementing, and they disseminated out the survey at the end. And when they disseminated the survey, they had about a 9-10% response rate. Well, that's not really the response rate that you really want. You want something much higher than that. And so we had some discussions around that with the project team about the dissemination method and what could be done to change the dissemination method. So there were a lot of tweaks with that. And so in a similar initiative that occurred about a month later, they implemented these changes and had a 40% response rate. Now you could say this is like really small because it's just increasing the response rate on a small initiative, but by having larger representation of their population and the people that were there, now they have better data to be able to make decisions and to be able to incorporate those stronger decisions moving forward. and that will help them to achieve their outcomes. And that's really the point of developmental evaluation. So let me go ahead and pause there and see if there are any other questions. Elise, are there any questions that have come in?
Yes. Can you clarify when would you use developmental evaluation?
Yeah, I think that's like a really good question because I think all things being equal, historically, you would primarily use developmental evaluation on projects that were more new, not on projects in which they were long-standing initiatives. You would use a different frame. You would still use evaluation, but just a different frame of evaluation for that. I think it's particularly important to use evaluation when you have emergent issues. And so I say that as a caveat because I think right now, particularly within higher ed, so many schools are dealing with a lot of emergent factors. And so really needing to make sure that evaluation or some type of data gathering is occurring tightly with the data, with the decision points is really important. Responding and the need for schools that have to respond to COVID, in particular, having to move very abruptly from face-to-face courses to remote learning, that really creates the need for a lot of learning to occur within the teams that are making that decision. And I should say as a sidebar, we actually have, if there's anyone interested, we've been gathering out potential questions that you can pose to students for their end of course surveys to be able to ask and to try to get information about their experiences with that transition. But I think right now, to fundamentally answer your question, is that there are a lot of situations right now where developmental evaluation would probably be very appropriate. Are there any other questions?
That is all at this time.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks for that great question. And I think that kind of gives rise to the next kind of piece that we wanted to share is, and how do you get other people on board with this? Very often in dealing with evaluation and evaluation issues, you're really hopeful that people are enthused and excited about that topic. And sometimes they're just not because they don't want to have that informed information, but for a host of reasons. So instead of people looking like this, very often, sometimes they're looking like this. And so the question for people when you're actually sold on the idea and you believe in using evaluation for continuous improvement purposes is, how do you get other people to buy into it as well? And here are a couple of things that you can do. One, the first item is in regards to make sure that you're really linking out the evaluation to a larger frame, making sure that it's linked to a greater mission or achievement. And that could be the larger mission of what a project is, or actually on a much larger scale, it could be linked to the mission of the organization as well. And that when that's linked to a mission and something bigger, then it's not feeling as though it's something extra and something that has to be added on top of everything else that has to be done. The other item that you can do too is do a stakeholder analysis. So one benefit of actual stakeholder analysis, and it doesn't have to be done in a highly formal way, it could be slightly informal, is understanding that every stakeholder has a stake. So every person who's invested has something that they want out of that, and they have slightly different perspectives. And so you may have the PI, the project owner, administrator, institutional researcher, program officer, or funder, and everyone has a different perspective. And so at least being very conscious of what their perspective and what they may want out of the evaluation is really helpful in regards to how do you frame that message. And while this sounds like a lot of extra work, really in practice, it's not. It's really just taking the perspective of the other person and helping to frame a message in that regards for them. The other piece I think is useful too is making sure to listen for pain points. Making sure that you find those moments that are quote unquote coachable or learning moments as well. So one of the ways that I think about this is you've heard the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Well, I often tease and say, but you can't put salt in his hay. And so the idea is once someone has salt in their hay, they're a little more thirsty for water. And the same idea when there's some pain points with the project and helping to just show how evaluation could help in terms of addressing those pain points, it's much more likely to be able to be persuasive with why evaluations of value and why evaluation can help for continuous improvement purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and see if there are any other questions. Madison, are there any other questions out there?
There is. Sorry. What other ways can you get folks to buy into evaluation, especially for continuous improvement?
Yeah. So I think there are, I will probably reiterate the first one in terms of mission alignment. I think in regards to making sure that you really are aligning what the purpose of that project is with the goals that that person has or the organization. I think that that's really key. Reiterating the stakeholder analysis would be another one that I would highlight. But I think another piece too is really understanding who influencers are and who the understanding who are individuals who can be persuasive and really making sure that you gain buy-in for those individuals. Gaining buy-in from individuals who, if they're sold on continuous improvement, then other people would be sold on continuous improvement as well. But I think it's really important too that just having the experience of being able to use the evaluation for decision making and seeing how that feedback loop works. So seeing how you're not getting the outcomes that you really want, you use evaluation, you're using that feedback loop, and you're getting the outcomes that you want, that really, to me, also seems to be very persuasive. Kind of gaining experience with evaluation in that way to know that it really does help and really does help to achieve your outcomes. So I think that we are pretty close to time here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I really hope you were able to get a lot of great information from this webinar experience. And you will receive an email with information on a survey. And if you can complete that survey, we would really appreciate it. We are interested in our own continuous improvement processes. And so I would really like to have that feedback so that we can make sure that we're offering other resources that would be helpful for you all. So hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.